Right. So I'm going to keep my comments very short and look for the quick fire round during the question answers. A lot of points have been covered. A lot of issues I agree with Admiral Koda and Dr. Lee, but with Dr. Lee, I may have a little difference in opinion, and I think that we can have a friendly chat and agree to disagree, perhaps if required. Coming back to what you'd asked me about continental India and maritime India, I think the focus on theatre commands, the Maritime Theatre Command, and what the Defense Minister said recently in his visit to Karwar is a clear indication that there is equal weightage that requires to be given on the maritime in the maritime domain as well as on the continent if we are to bear weight and defend our territory, one, protect our interests, two, and to ensure that we come out advantageous. So there has to be an equal impetus, and I think that is being done. And only time will tell as to when India is more maritime prowess than it has today, which even today is quite a lot. So it is time, but yes, there is emphasis on the maritime domain. Having said that, let me get back to the issue at hand. And I'd like to give it a little different tinge. Let's forget that Quad means anything. Let's just say it is a term. Let's forget that Quad means four. Let's just say it is by chance that in 2004, when the tsunami hit, we had four nations who came together, who were able to operate together, mainly due to the like-mindedness approach. And the main issue was to combat the threat and the challenge that tsunami had thrown into the region, which today we call the Indo-Pacific. And that's where I would like to remain a little focused. And let's just say the Quad is a grouping. But I'll borrow a line from Clausewitz here when he talked about alliances. And he said that alliances are either a body of equals or it is led by a hegemon. So let's forget for once that US is the strongest nation here. Let's have a look at the other three nations that form part of the Quad, and we will look at them as middle powers, but I'll come back that to a little later. The whole issue where Quad comes and we remain, say, China-centric, and we remain focused on military power is because of the initial QSD issue, quadrilateral security dialogue. It's time we remove this term security. It's time we stop looking at it as an equivalence of naval power or an equivalence of only exercise by navies. We need to look at it a broader ambit of security, and this is what we call in NMF holistic maritime security. There are more elements to security that the Quad can do, and for that you need to be inclusive. And if we call the Indo-Pacific a free and open, and what India had added, the Prime Minister added the word inclusive, we need to be more inclusive. If we are to look at the Indo-Pacific, and Dr. Lee mentioned different geostrategies and nations viewing this area differently, and obviously everybody has their own threats, everybody has their own challenges. The Indo-Pacific is too large to be looked under one lens. We need to look at it in sub-regions. And if we are to divide the sub-regions, and let me extend the argument by saying, let's start from the Persian Gulf. Let's look at the eastern coast of Africa, which has different dynamics. Let's look at the broader Indian Ocean region. We may look at it as the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, because both subsets of the Indian Ocean region have different dynamics. Look at the success in the Bay of Bengal. Look at where the Arabian Sea stands. You cross the Malacca Strait, you're entering South China Sea. Totally different dynamics. There are nations who are Indian Ocean nations, and there are also Southeast Asian nations. See the quandary they lie in. Then we move across to Vietnam, Philippines, we come to, say, Japan. The East Asian or the East China Sea itself has different dynamics. You go north, you got Kuril Islands, Japan has an issue. You come down south, you got Australia surrounded by three oceans. And here is where geostrategy comes into play. Island nations generally are more secure because they have a body of water which separates them from facing immediate threats on the border, which India faces. And I give you the example of England in World War II. Perhaps if it was a continental nation, history would have been different. And I always tell this to my US friends, that if the Canadians had been like the Chinese and the Mexicans like the Pakistanis, your geostrategy, your outlook would have been different. And that is where if nations understand this aspect, they will understand where does India come from. And of course, we stand by a strategic autonomy. When you look at our relationship with the US, it's been a roller coaster ride. Right from the days of independence. It's only after around the turn of the century, around 2000, when things started changing. We signed a lot of agreements, yes, but I'm drifting away from my main issue out here. So the idea is that the moment you mention navies, the moment you mention Malabar, the moment you mention China, the moment you look at Quad as a hard security aspect, nations tend to get scared. What have the ASEAN nations been saying? Do not force us to take sides. They're in agreement that Quad does bring some amount of stability or security angle with them. But they always say, do not expect us to take sides. When you look at their geography, we can understand why. Therefore, if we are to make Quad a success, if we are to see the Quad prospering, then we need to look at other security issues. Let it be economics. Let it be climate change. Some has been mentioned by Admiral Koda, right? Let's look at the effects of climate change. Let's look at blue economy. Let's look at making the Indo-Pacific a favorable and positive maritime environment or a continental environment for all nations to prosper together. And that linchpin could be the Quad. But for that to be the Quad, you need to look at something else. And here is where I bring in the issue of middle powers, middle power Quad. Most of the nations in Indo-Pacific, and if I take the definition of Barry Buzan from his regional security complex theory, then I would say in the broader Indo-Pacific, Japan, India, Australia are middle powers. Most of the nations in the Indo-Pacific are middle powers. They may have a stronger variation or a stand within their immediate neighborhood like India has, Japan has, Australia has, but we remain middle powers. And if you engage middle powers, then on the same balance, on the same level, there's a better understanding. And therefore, I think it is time that we start to look at Quad Plus. And this is what Admiral Koda had mentioned. I'm fully for it. It may be too premature for it to come about, but I am very sure its time will come. So you need to look at other nations. Even in the meetings, even in the various meetings that have been mentioned, including Quad meetings, other nations have been invited directly or indirectly. So therefore, the doors are open. So if the Quad is to prosper, if it is to be an Indo-Pacific entity, then you need to engage more nations, and that's when we need to look at Quad Plus. And why do I say this? Let's just look at the four nations, US, India, Australia, Japan. You see the number of platforms, the number of exercises across the Indo-Pacific they engage in, and they engage in other nations. Similarly, other nations also engage, and I can give you some platforms like IORA, BIMSTEC, East Asia Summit, ASEAN plus plus whatever we had, ADM plus plus whatever we have, WPNS, SCO. You have most of these nations engaging each other or other nations on these platforms, including China. And let me bring China into the debate. So therefore, if these middle powers operate together, and then of course, US is said to be there, and we start looking at each other and we start engaging, there will be an understanding of interoperability and understanding of each other's threats and challenges, the ability to push the aspects on a common anvil. And this is where capabilities and capacities come in, is that if we recognize the capacity of a particular nation and the capability of another nation, we can optimize the output into the security fields, which I mentioned, apart from hard military. And therefore, you will have a sort of a level playing field, if I can call that, across the Indo-Pacific. All nations, again, you just look at the number of bilateral, trilateral agreements. Now we've got India, Japan, Australia. We've got India, Australia, France coming in. We've had the four Quad nations doing a maritime exercise in the Bay of Bengal, La Perouse with France. We've got a Royal Naval Flotilla coming into this area shortly. And then, of course, we're going to have engagements with them. So it's time to look beyond four. It's time to look beyond hard military. It's time to look at an acceptable aspect that all nations who are a little wary of the security element in QSD or in Quad itself, to get them on board. And that, to my mind, is the future of Quad. And I would just like to end by saying this, that Dr. Lee, you mentioned net security provider. That's one point I had. How do you define net security provider? I was party to the revision of the Indian Maritime Security Strategy document. We attempted to define maritime net security provider to explain to the world what we meant by it. But more importantly, nobody can do it alone. So therefore, it has to be a cooperative effort. And that is where, again, you need to engage more nations. Therefore, we need to expand Quad. We need to look at Malabar separately. Let's not mix it up with Quad. Let's not frighten nations who may be a little wary of taking sides. How will China view us? We've had a long discussion on China. Therefore, the The effort should be to make the Indo-Pacific and the sub-regions ensure that we have a favorable and positive environment that will enable the nations to progress together. And to give you an example, India's initiative on the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, I might call it. We have Japan, who has taken on one pillar. We have Australia, who's taken on a second pillar. We have France, who's recently come on board and taken a pillar. India is looking at one. There are 7 pillars, 5 are taken. It's not that only one nation look at each pillar. So we have initiatives like this. This is all part of the Indo-Pacific. These can be merged into one entity and looked at. And everybody, and the buzzword is inclusive. Unfortunately, on all statements by nations except India, everybody uses free and open. India uses free, open, and inclusive. Let's not make the Quad exclusive. Let's not make Malabar exclusive. Let's not make anything exclusive. Let's get more and more inclusive nations on board. I pause here. Thank you.